Hello and welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. Today's video, we're going to talk about the economic future of South Korea, and I am going to do this as also a reaction video that has been long requested by viewers of this show to Hosier. And this country video, the one that made the most sense for me to react to, is South Korea, because I want to do a discussion about my outlook for the economic future of Korea. First, really the beginning of it, the video, he discusses basically how South Korea is geopolitically isolated and is effectively an island because North Korea is disconnected and won't allow any trade to go through them to South Korea. So they have to rely on importing and exporting everything by sea. And also due to the relatively lack of natural resources, South Korea is a net food and energy importer. And it's a similar situation for Japan, where they are dependent on energy primarily from the Middle East. And they need oil prices low to keep their manufacturing capacity as strong as usual. But that's really all. There's nothing really unusual and out of consensus there. That's just kind of the basics of the country, but we'll keep going for the video starting at this point.
For the Koreans, the actual land here is cold, hilly, dense, and not rich in really anything at all. It was the water that made them rich. First of all, they have nothing they need. They need to import food, fertilizer, and 95% of their energy needs. South Korea is in the top 10 for natural gas, oil, and coal imports. Above them is a crack addict, tyrannical state who has dedicated literally its entire existence to wiping the South off the map. Half of the South's population who live in the greater Seoul area could legitimately be blown up within it.
The whole Korea situation reminds me of a lighter version of Israel-Palestine, that North Korea talks a big talk that they want to wipe out South Korea, but just due to the way that global military alliances are right now and how much in dire poverty the country of North Korea is, they really lack the resources to be an effective threat to South Korea. If it really wasn't for the support of China, there may not even be a North Korea really right now. So whenever markets get scared about North Korea attacking Seoul, or if you see any declines in Korean equities or the won because of that, I consider that a buy the dip opportunity.
The West, who they're not on the best ideological or economic terms with,
for a country that they're not on the best ideological or economic terms with, over 25% of South Korean exports and South Korean imports come from the People's Republic of China,
despite being their largest trading partner, and to the east is their only friend. In the region, it's Japan. They f***ing hate each other. Maybe it's from that one time Japan burnt all their cities, killed their people, raped all their women, and still didn't apologize or even recognize it happened. Maybe that's why. The only reason they're friends is because of this guy, the U.
That is true. Both countries have military bases of the U.S. in their borders. And yeah, they're not natural allies if it wasn't for their guarantor of defense. Historically, these countries have been rivals, and they've had wars with each other and occupation from Japan as recently as the 1940s. So yeah, I mean, if the U.S. was out of the picture in Asia, there would probably be a good chance that Japan and China would be fighting for who has their sphere of influence effectively control Korea. Not a great situation.
Bring? Well, if you ask this in the 1950s, the answer would be not much. South Korea, from decades of Japanese occupation and a war right after with the North, was one of the poorest nations on the planet in the 50s and 60s. About as poor as North Korea. And today, after decades of watching motivational videos and taking ice-cold showers, it is one of the most developed nations on Earth, about 30 times richer than the North is now.
Given how intense their study habits are and how bad the hours are for most corporate jobs in South Korea, the national hustle culture analogy really isn't that far off.
Now, what's the secret guide? Let's go back to that geography to tell you. Like I said before, they pretty much have no natural resources and need to rely on foreign aid for enough food to eat. Damn, that's not going to help them get rich. They need to think outside of the box. And so their dictator at the time, Park Chung-lee, thought of a corporatist strategy. It was either the least free market system or the most goddamn free market economy this world has ever seen, depending on how you look at it. The strategy? Set up huge businesses called chaebols, literally meaning rich families, and give them huge subsidies, huge tax breaks, massive loans, and made special tariffs just for them. Gee, sounds a bit unfair, right? Yeah, it does, but they weren't meant to compete inside of South Korea.
Yeah, it's the standard rapid industrialization model via financial repression supporting national champions. The East Asian growth model worked the best for the countries that industrialized the quickest. So Japan started this process of Meiji Restoration, so that's why they are the most developed country in Asia, because they got on board quickly. Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore were the next three, and that's why they are all developed countries or right about that threshold of being a developed nation. And yeah, it does work for rapid growth, especially if other people aren't doing it, and you can compete by having very high skilled labor at cheap prices. Like all these countries have very high average national IQs and high educational quality and relatively low wages compared to the US and Europe. However, in Singapore and South Korea, that's starting to change as they've gotten close to parity with some of the larger countries in Western Europe and have passed many of the other ones up in terms of GDP per capita. The chaebol have maybe too much of a good thing at this point. Their political powers basically stagnates any sort of domestic competition, which limits growth, and it also creates a monopoly for hiring as well. Like if you take it to the extreme, like Samsung and all of its affiliated subsidiaries are over 25% of the market cap of the South Korean stock market and are over 20% of the total GDP of the country. And that level of concentration puts it heavily at risk if consumer preferences shift away from Samsung, or just that the company just gets complacent and doesn't grow as well as it did in the past. So chaebol reform is one of the catalysts that I'm looking for to see if South Korea can continue its stage of development and move up on the next stage of growth. Without chaebol reform, there's a good chance that the country stagnates.
They were meant to compete globally. The point of the chaebol was to export as many finished goods as humanly possible. It started off with them exporting things like steel and chemicals, but as the South Koreans invested more into education, aka making their kids cram 12 hours of knowledge into a day, they obviously got a little bit smarter, and it evolved into exporting high-tech items like cars, phones, and TVs. On the global stage, these chaebols were a miracle on the Han River, turning American dollars into South Korean won, changing the country from a backwater into a top 10 most exporting nation. But domestically, you might have been able to guess that these rich families who were selected have a little bit of outsized power. First of all, they do everything in the country. Take for example the chaebol latte. They started out as a chewing gum company but evolved into selling food, drinks, retail stores, construction, chemicals, resorts, hotels, aluminum, finance, amusement parks, and digital technology. Talk about monopoly, and there's still only the...
Yeah, the conglomerate structure does make it frustrating actually from the perspective of an investor. Because if you want to have a pure play on a particular industry or sector in the country, it's difficult to do that because pretty much everything is owned by chaebols who have pieces of everything, which also suppresses their valuations to a certain degree.
The fifth largest chaebol, Almost everything needed to run the country comes from a conglomerate. It's estimated that about 60% of the South Korean growth came from chaebols, and today they make up about 80% of South Korean product despite only accounting for around 10% of the jobs.
Yeah, the concentration among the top 10 is even bigger than I thought. I knew Samsung alone was huge, but chaebols is over almost 80% of GDP, have a real choke on the economy. And again, chaebol reform is what's going to be needed if South Korea is going to take its next steps for growth.
They don't keep around slackers either. If you don't export enough, you're cut off, so they tend to be the ones to drive innovation in Korea. But some of them do stick around. LG, Hyundai, and Samsung. They're the big dogs in Korea. Samsung alone makes up about 20% of GDP, and they have done very well in the global economy, even starting a blue-green text bubble war with Apple. The advantages of chaebols are obvious, quick exports and high innovative growth, but the disadvantages are possibly even more obvious. Corruption in the government, terrible labor laws, actually just ignoring labor laws altogether, and mass inequality. They led to a broken social ladder in South Korea. Well, less of a ladder and more like a cliff with...
I think the problem with South Korea in terms of its living cost is not really entirely due to the chaebol. It's just it's a small country, and most people have to be crammed in Seoul for economic opportunities, and as a result, that bids up housing costs. And the excess density is what is also driving the birth rate, because if there's as in every developed country, the main catalyst, the strongest correlating indicator for birth rates is the affordability of a 3+ bedroom house. And relative to income, South Korea is one of the hardest places to do that. And therefore, South Korea is one of the world's lowest birth rates. Like, if trends continue, South Koreans will not exist within 700 years.
Korea #1 for lowest birth rates worldwide. As of the early 2020s, it's around 0.8 kids for every woman, which means that 52 million people right now, they could easily drop to 36 million by 2050 and 15 million by 2100. South Korea...
Not entirely a bad thing, given that South Korea's national debt isn't that high. So they'd be in a better position for a population decline than other countries. And yeah, I think these things are kind of self-correcting in the sense that if the population drops enough, the amount of housing and college slots for kids and job opportunities per capita, especially in a world of automation where you don't need as many people to do stuff, like it's quality over quantity, will be better. And so therefore, they will start having kids again. I mean, if the countries that are struggling with birth rate, South Korea is in relatively better position because its national debt is not that high compared to Japan or to the United States or to Western Europe. So it can the cost of the national pension scheme won't be as backbreaking, and they have just the problem is again they have excess population density. There are too many people in South Korea, not necessarily from a pure carrying capacity. They could obviously afford to feed people. It's a developed nation, but in terms of like that they have enough space to live the suburban lifestyle which they feel like they want to justify having children.
Korea is a shrinking country, and contrary to the popular belief among academics, it wasn't the fact that League of Legends doomed South Korea to be a nation of virgins. Nah, it's more complicated than that. There's the geographical explanation, where these mountains force the small country of millions to get cozy in small pockets of flat...
Yeah, that exasperates the problem. I told you, it's already a very small country with a lot of people, and if mountains make a big chunk of it uninhabitable, that even further magnifies my point that density is what's driving the demographic problem more than anything.
Flat land to build their farms and cities. If you look at the actual density map, the Koreans love to crowd together, limiting precious space. The workers of South Korea just don't have time to raise kids. They're too busy getting more Samsung exports out to the world.
Yeah, the bigger risk really for Korea, I think, for that work culture is not the fact they're not having kids. It's they could have a lying flat movement or an herbivore movement like that's happened in Japan and China, where they're like, hey, look, no matter how hard I work, I'm never going to get ahead. And since I'm like an only child or from a small family, the inheritance I get from my parents or a small amount of gig work can maybe cover my rent, and I can chill out and play video games and cancel the idea of having a family. And I mean, that is kind of, I think, the other catalyst, which maybe he gets into it later in this video. And I've noticed that a lot of things I'm saying as my talking points for Korea, he actually fills them in. Even though this is a very fast-paced video, he seems to be cramming a lot of the key factors in here.
It could mean recession and stagnation, and trust me, populations don't get any more equal during recessions. And of course, less people means less power and less...
Actually, they do get more equal during recessions because the value of Samsung stock and the chaebols stock prices are go down, and that balances out the quality. It's just not a good trade-off. Like, falling living standards on the aggregate to lower inequality is cutting off your nose to spite your face. Yeah, overall, I think he does a good job on his video, and he does highlight the risks. My view on the economic future of Korea is probably a little bit more positive than Hosier's is. I think that they are a leader in innovation. They've been able to continuously grow and escape the middle income trap. They don't have as much government to GDP as other developed nations, and they have a weaker social safety net than a lot of other developed nations, and so as a result, the dependency ratio does not matter as much. In fact, really the lower population density could help them in the long run, as long as it's not a security threat and you have China or Japan try to invade them, which I don't think is very likely. And then they also have the upside kicker of reunification with the North. North Korea's unstable regime. If China decides they no longer can afford or no longer willing to support them, they could break down, and they'll probably likely sue for peace for some sort of reunification. However, given the gap between South Korea and North Korea in terms of GDP per capita, it's almost like 50-1 at this point, whereas in Germany it was closer maybe to 5-8-1 in terms of GDP per capita ratio from west to east. It's going to be a lot more expensive for South Korea to unify and invest in the North to make it economically viable, and then also the multiple generations of cultural divide, which lasted much longer than the Berlin Wall, will make it more difficult to assimilate a population that is just not really accustomed to a lot of the things we take for granted, such as a free market economy and basic civil liberties and a certain level of technological development, whereas North Korea has really just basically been just this rogue state that's been isolated from the world and is stuck in a different era and has a cult-like following, whether legitimate or forced by the point of a gun, for its leadership. And then you have the elites there who have everything to lose because they would not really be able to make it into the elites of South Korean politics in the event of unification. So it'll be a much more expensive, but North Korea, unlike South Korea, actually has a lot of natural resources. It has also a lower population density. So integrating it could be just the kicker to make South Korea more self-sufficient, and the population boost can make up for the demographic decline in the South and could balance their demographic problem a little bit and make them just overall a stronger force and possibly just a power that could challenge Japan and China in Asia in terms of geopolitical might. So I'm not saying that it's inevitable that there's unification, and I have no idea when that would be, but it is a nice little upside kicker. And the other things they can do to improve their economy is chaebol reform, corporate governance reform to make companies more responsive to minority shareholders and pay better dividends and run the companies in a way that does not just favor the chaebol family interest, but favors the entire shareholder base, or just reforms to make the market more competitive. Like, I thought the current president was supposed to be the Reagan of Korea and make some of those promises, but some scandals and some other political issues and the economy being pretty weak due to what's going on in China pretty much derailed a lot of what Yoon's intended plans were in terms of chaebol reform and free market reforms. But maybe there's a chance that him or a future South Korean leadership can actually execute that plan. As I like to do in these videos, especially to help the context for my American viewers, for countries whose population or economy size is similar to a US state, I like to make a comparison video to compare the country to a US state to see what are the commonalities, what are the differences, and kind of really how big does this country's economy really mean on the global level. If you like more of this content and you want to see more of these country videos, I recommend you like, subscribe, and share our content with your network and friends. We've already done about 20 economic futures videos, and we're going to be doing more countries in the next several months. But let's get on with the comparison. South Korea and Illinois actually have more in common than you would think, given how far away they are from each other. Land-wise, Illinois is slightly bigger, but they are comparable enough that they both cleanly fit in the map of Illinois. I mean, and then when it comes to their population, though, South Korea dwarfs Illinois. 52 million people live in South Korea versus 12.7 million in Illinois, so it's about 4 times. However, the GDP spread is a lot narrower, with South Korea's GDP being about 1.7 trillion and Illinois being 1.07 trillion US dollars. But Illinoisans make a lot more money on average, with a GDP per capita of around 85,000 versus 33,000 in South Korea. The other thing really is density. South Korea, 49% of their population lives in Greater Seoul. 75% of Illinois' population is in Chicagoland, which is Chicago and the suburbs. However, despite more of the population being concentrated in Illinois, in terms of the density of the Seoul metro area, the number of people per square mile in Seoul is 6 times that of Chicago. So you're not going to have as many of the leafy suburbs and the space that many Chicagoans take for granted in Seoul. In terms of Fortune 500 companies, both countries have a lot of global Fortune 500 companies. Illinois has 10. Most notable of these include McDonald's, Caterpillar, and Archer Daniels Midland, and Citadel. I don't really think Citadel's in the Fortune 500, but they're a pretty big, influential firm headquartered in Chicago, and many others. Whereas you have 12 to 18 on the Fortune 500 list for South Korea. Could even be lower than 12. But the reason why it's a range and not a set number is because a lot of the companies listed are subsidies or are very closely relatedly held by different chaebols. So do we count them as separate companies, or we just count them as part of the greater chaebol? So that's why there's a range there for South Korea. Both regions have a strong history of corruption. South Korea's had numerous scandals. Most of them either involved bribery and or rigging opinion polls. They even had one of their recent presidents impeached and convicted to 24 years in prison for corruption. Illinois, not any better. I mean, Chicago has a reputation of being the most corrupt city in the United States of America. And 4 of the last 10 governors in Illinois, and it was a bipartisan affair among these governors, have faced jail time and went to prison. So, yeah, both countries have a history of corruption. Illinois, not country, but both regions. They both have a major northern rival. South Korea, it's obviously North Korea, and Illinois, it's the Green Bay Packers. The dominant major cities I mentioned they both have is Seoul and Chicago. They're both are a history of being industrial countries. However, Chicago's and Illinois has diversified a lot, and they're not real. They have a lot of things. It's just being a farming hub and finance, and other industries now just purely beyond heavy industry. And a lot of the heavy industry has really moved out of Rust Belt, which includes Illinois, whereas South Korea is more tech focused with its manufacturing and is a much bigger role of its economy is exporting goods in overseas markets. So overall, that's my comparison between Illinois and South Korea. And if you like these videos, again, please like and subscribe. And thank you for watching.